They say silence is golden, but in the Brown family, silence has never been peaceful, has always been loaded, waiting, dangerous. For years, silence was how things were controlled. Silence was how feelings were buried, questions were ignored, and children learned that speaking up came with consequences. But this Christmas, silence stopped being a shield and became a weapon, and the most unexpected person picked it up. The holiday season always brings nostalgia, even to broken families. Snow falling, lights glowing, traditions pretending nothing has changed. In Salt Lake City, life had settled into something quieter, something safer. No cameras, no shouting, no rules taped to refrigerators. Just warmth, routine, and a sense of normal that had been missing for years. That calm was interrupted the moment a package appeared on the porch. A simple cardboard box. A return address that said everything before it ever got opened. Flagstaff. It wasn't excitement that filled the house when the box arrived. It was tension. The kind that creeps into your chest before your mind catches up. Because this wasn't just a Christmas gift. This was history knocking at the door. This was the past trying to reinsert itself into a life that had finally learned how to breathe. For most kids, a gift from their father would spark curiosity. But curiosity requires trust, and trust had been drained from this relationship long ago. The box sat untouched. No tearing of wrapping paper. No shaking it to guess what was inside. Just stillness. And in that stillness was something far louder than anger. Clarity. To understand why this moment mattered so much, you have to go back. Not weeks, not months, years. Back to a time when rules replaced affection and obedience became the price of love. Back to the COVID era, when protection was the excuse and control was the goal. Typed up protocols that looked less like safety measures and more like a loyalty test. A system where access to a father depended on compliance, and questioning anything meant being cut off completely. That was the world this child grew up watching. Not participating in loudly, but observing quietly. While adults argued and alliances shifted, she watched patterns form. She noticed who was always present and who was always missing. She noticed how rules bent easily in one house and hardened like steel in another. She noticed how attention flowed toward Robin's children while others were expected to understand, to wait, to accept less. There is a special kind of damage that comes from being physically present but emotionally unseen. From realizing that love is conditional long before you're old enough to name it. That damage doesn't always show up as rebellion. Sometimes it shows up as patience, as silence, as a child who learns early that expecting too much only leads to disappointment. There were moments the cameras caught that told the story better than any confessional ever could. The bike riding scene wasn't about learning balance or celebrating a milestone. It was about performance. About frustration. About a father making the moment about himself. That wasn't an exception. That was the pattern. Fast forward to now, and the power dynamics had shifted. Not because apologies were made. Not because effort was shown. But because distance created perspective. In Salt Lake City, life looked different. A home where no one needed permission to exist. Where affection wasn't earned through obedience. Where showing up didn't require an audience. And in that home was something else that changed everything. Quiet contrast. A man who didn't demand respect but earned it by being consistent. A man who didn't need to dominate to feel important. A man who showed up because that's what love looks like, not because it fed an ego. Watching that kind of fatherhood rewire something deep inside a child. It shows them what they were missing without anyone having to say a word. That's why the box didn't feel like a gift. It felt like an intrusion, like manipulation wrapped in cardboard. A physical attempt to reclaim relevance. Because when control starts slipping, it often comes disguised as generosity. Somewhere in Flagstaff, that package was sent with expectations. Maybe even confidence. Because in the past, gifts worked. Gifts created obligation. Gifts allowed the sender to feel like the hero without doing the work. This wasn't about knowing a daughter. It was about reminding her who had resources, who had power, who could still reach her. But something had changed. The old script didn't apply anymore. Days passed. The box stayed closed. No thank you message. No reaction. Just silence. And silence in this family has always triggered panic. Because silence means loss of control. This wasn't passive. This wasn't confusion. This was restraint. And restraint is dangerous to people who rely on emotional leverage. Somewhere between those quiet days and the decision that followed, something clicked. The realization that accepting the gift would mean accepting the premise behind it. That keeping it would mean agreeing to a transaction that had never been fair. So the decision wasn't to throw it away. That would have been easy, private, forgettable. Instead, the choice was deliberate, active, the kind of choice that requires effort. The box was taped back up, labels reattached, time spent standing in line, money spent on postage, each step reinforcing the same message. This does not belong here. That package began its journey back across state lines, carrying with it something far heavier than whatever was inside. Carried rejection, not of a gift but of a system. A refusal to participate in the same cycle that had hurt so many before. Back in Flagstaff, anticipation likely turned into irritation, then into anger. Tracking numbers refresh. Notifications stay silent. And then the update appears. Return to sender. But what truly shattered the illusion wasn't just the box coming back. It was what came with it. Because attached to that rejection was something no amount of money could undo. A message so simple, so precise, it cut straight through years of justification. For words. Words that would reportedly unravel everything. And that's where the real damage began. The box didn't arrive with noise. No confrontation. No warning. Just a quiet delivery, sitting on the porch in Flagstaff like an accusation wrapped in cardboard. The kind of object that forces you to stop pretending everything is fine. For days, anticipation had likely turned into irritation, irritation into anger, and anger into that familiar brown family panic. The panic that comes when control slips through your fingers and there's nothing left to grab onto. Because this wasn't supposed to happen. In the old system, gifts worked. Money worked. Grand gestures worked. They created obligation. They bought silence. They bought compliance. They allowed the sender to feel righteous without doing the hard, humiliating work of repair. This was supposed to be easy. Send the box. Wait for gratitude. Reassert relevance. Restore the hierarchy. But instead, the hierarchy came back stamped with rejection. Inside that house, the atmosphere reportedly shifted instantly. There is a particular kind of rage that doesn't explode right away. Simmers. Paces. It circles the room looking for someone to blame. And when the box came back unopened, it removed every comforting excuse. It couldn't be dismissed as taste. It couldn't be reframed as teenage pickiness. It couldn't be spun into, she didn't like it. The message was clear before the tape was even cut. It didn't matter what was inside. And then there was the note. Short. Handwritten. For words that reportedly landed like a demolition charge. Love can't be bought. Those words didn't insult. They didn't accuse. They didn't scream. They simply stated a truth that dismantled an entire worldview. A worldview built on the belief that provision equals devotion, that money equals love, that effort can be measured in dollars rather than presents. For someone whose identity is deeply tied to being the provider, the patriarch, the man at the center of everything, those words are not just criticism. They are erasure. They say your currency has no value here. They say the thing you rely on to maintain power doesn't work anymore. That kind of realization doesn't lead to reflection. It leads to injury. Narcissistic injury. The kind that feels like humiliation, betrayal, and rage all at once. Because in that moment, it wasn't just a daughter rejecting a gift. It was a daughter rejecting the terms of the relationship altogether. The reaction inside the house was reportedly immediate and volatile. Tears that weren't about loss but about offense. Anger framed as heartbreak. A familiar narrative spinning itself back into place. This wasn't a boundary, they told themselves. This was an attack. This wasn't independence. This was manipulation. Someone must have put her up to this. Because accepting that a child made this decision on her own would mean accepting something far worse. It would mean she had seen everything. It would mean she had watched, listened, remembered, and judged. And the verdict wasn't favorable. So the blame shifted outward as it always does. Christine, David, anyone but the mirror. The idea that a teenager could look at years of absence, favoritism, and conditional affection and decide she deserved better was unthinkable. Much easier to believe she had been poisoned, coached, turned against them. That's the irony of control. It convinces you that everyone else lacks agency, while you cling desperately to your own. The unopened box became proof, not of rejection, but of conspiracy. Proof that the narrative was slipping. Proof that the old levers no longer worked. And somewhere in that house filled with expensive decor and unresolved resentment, the realization crept in that something irreversible had happened. While all of this was unfolding in Flagstaff, life in Salt Lake City continued quietly. The absence of the box changed the energy in the home. There was relief, lightness, the feeling that a boundary had been drawn and respected. No yelling, no retaliation, no chaos, just peace. That contrast is important, because peace is terrifying to people who thrive on turmoil. The decision to return the package wasn't impulsive. It wasn't dramatic in the way tantrums are dramatic. It was methodical, thoughtful. The kind of choice that comes from clarity, not anger. Each step, taping the box, standing in line, paying for shipping, was an act of self-respect. A physical declaration that this cycle stops here. And then, as if the universe wanted to underline the point, the silence was broken. Not by a phone call, not by a confrontation, but by a photograph. It appeared quietly, like most powerful things do. Christmas image posted online. No forced poses. No stiff smiles. Just warmth. Comfort. A teenager relaxed in a space where she didn't have to perform. A mother finally at peace. A man standing nearby, not as a ruler, but as a presence. The caption was simple. Maybe even casual. But the implication was devastating. Real family. Those two words did what years of criticism couldn't. They reframed everything. Because if this was real, then what came before wasn't. And that suggestion, that the family structure once presented as sacred and unbreakable was actually a performance, cut deeper than any accusation. The internet noticed immediately. Fans saw the body language. The shoulders relaxed. The smiles unguarded. The absence of tension that had been present for years. This wasn't rebellion. This was safety. And safety is unmistakable. Back in Flagstaff, that image reportedly hit harder than the returned box ever could. Because gifts can be dismissed. Notes can be minimized. But a picture like that, a picture that says without words, "I'm okay without you," that's unforgivable to someone who needs to be needed. The meltdown wasn't just about jealousy. It was about replacement, about seeing someone else living the role you believe belongs to you. About realizing that love didn't disappear when you stepped back. It simply rerouted. And that's when the narrative hardened. Parental alienation, brainwashing, disrespect, disloyalty. Words used not to heal, but to avoid accountability. Words that sound clinical but function as weapons. What they couldn't admit was the simplest truth of all. This wasn't about a gift. This was about a girl who grew up watching promises break, rules change, and affection come with strings attached. A girl who learned that love shouldn't feel like pressure. That peace shouldn't feel like guilt. The box coming back wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous to the old order. Because once a child learns they can say no and survive it, there is no going back. And the next move was already forming. Speculation filled the silence almost immediately. Because when something isn't opened, imagination takes over. What was inside that box became the question everyone wanted answered. Not because the contents mattered, but because of what they represented. When a father sends a gift to a daughter he barely knows anymore, it reveals more about him than it ever could about her. People began asking the obvious question. What do you send a teenager whose life you haven't been part of? You don't know her favorite music. You don't know what she reads. You don't know how she dresses or what makes her laugh. You don't know the version of her that exists outside your own memory. So whatever was inside that box was never going to be personal. It couldn't be. Had to be symbolic. The first theory felt familiar. Expensive but impersonal. Jewelry chosen not for style but for significance. Something heavy, something flashy, something that says, I spent money rather than I paid attention. The kind of gift that comes with invisible strings attached. The kind that turns affection into obligation. If you wear it, you owe me. If you keep it, you're acknowledging me. If you accept it, you're agreeing to the terms. This is a pattern that has played out before. Big gestures instead of consistent presence. Money instead of apologies. Things instead of time. When emotional connection is difficult, material displays become the shortcut. They look good. They photograph well. They allow the giver to feel generous without being vulnerable. The second theory was darker. A nostalgia trap disguised as sentimentality. Framed photo. A memory from the cul-de-sac days. A reminder of a time when loyalty was expected and control was easier to maintain. A subtle attempt to weaponize the past. To say, look what we had. Look what was lost. Look what you're responsible for abandoning. If that was the case, returning it unopened wasn't cold. It was necessary, because nostalgia can be one of the most effective tools of manipulation. Blurs pain. Edits reality. It replaces accountability with longing. And once you open that door, it's hard to close again. But the truth is, the contents never mattered. Because the moment the box crossed state lines on its way back, its meaning was sealed. The rejection wasn't about taste. It wasn't about teenage rebellion. It was about refusing to participate in a transaction disguised as love. That refusal becomes even more powerful when you understand the financial context behind it. For years, there has been a visible imbalance in how resources were distributed. Lavish spending in one household. Endless decor, hobbies, toys, and attention for some children, while others were told to be patient, understanding, and low maintenance. The memory of arguing over medical expenses while luxury items piled up doesn't disappear just because time passes. Children remember. They always do. So when a box arrives from the place where those decisions were made, it carries more than a gift. Carries history. It carries every time effort was promised and never delivered. Every time money was available for aesthetics but not for care. Every time presence was replaced with excuses. In Salt Lake City, the home it arrived at stood in quiet contrast to all of that. Less show, less chaos, more substance, more consistency. And within that space, there was no pressure to react immediately. No expectation to perform gratitude. No fear of consequences for choosing honesty. That's where the David factor becomes impossible to ignore. Not because he told anyone what to do. Not because he interfered. But because he didn't. He didn't demand loyalty. He didn't hover. He didn't frame the situation as a test. He simply existed as a steady, calm presence. A man who didn't need to insert himself to feel important. A man whose authority came from reliability, not fear. For a teenager who grew up navigating emotional landmines, that kind of stability is transformative. It teaches you that boundaries don't lead to abandonment. That saying no doesn't mean punishment. That love doesn't require submission. That's why the choice to return the package wasn't made in fear. It was made in safety. And safety changes everything. The act itself was simple, but its implications were massive. By not opening the box, the message became absolute. It said, your intent doesn't matter. Your money doesn't matter. Your attempt to reclaim control doesn't matter. It stripped the sender of every excuse. There was no room for reinterpretation. Unopened meant uncontaminated. Untouched. Clean refusal. For someone who relies on control, that's devastating. Because control requires engagement. It requires reaction. It requires emotional buy-in. When none of that happens, the system collapses. That collapse became visible almost immediately. The silence wasn't filled with reflection. It was filled with resentment. The idea that a child could opt out of the dynamic entirely was intolerable. Not because of loss, but because of what it symbolized. A door closing that had always been assumed to stay open. And then came the public validation. The internet didn't just notice the photo, celebrated it. Comments poured in praising the confidence, the clarity, the strength. Words like queen and icon and boundary setter replaced the old narratives of sadness and worry. For the first time, the audience wasn't sympathizing with a neglected child. They were applauding a self-possessed young woman. That shift matters, because public perception has always been part of the equation. The cameras, the confessionals, the carefully crafted narratives. When the audience stops buying the storyteller panics. Every smile in that photo was a vote against the old system. Every comment was another crack in the image of unquestioned authority. And watching that support roll in from a distance, with no way to control it, must have been unbearable. But the real threat wasn't the internet. It was the precedent. Because if one child can say no and thrive, what does that mean for the others? If boundaries don't lead to disaster, what happens when more of them are drawn? If the spell is broken for one, how long before it shatters completely? This wasn't just about a Christmas gift anymore. It was about the collapse of a belief system. One built on hierarchy, obedience, and fear of rejection. One that only works when everyone plays their assigned role. The box came back. The note cut deep. The image went viral. And still, the old guard couldn't understand the simplest truth. This wasn't cruelty. This was clarity. And clarity is contagious. The box was back where it started, but nothing else was. It sat there like a monument to a system that no longer worked. A quiet reminder that power only exists when people agree to give it. Inside the house in Flagstaff, the air had reportedly grown heavy, thick with the kind of tension that doesn't explode all at once but seeps into every corner. The holidays were over, but the damage lingered. Because this wasn't just disappointment. This was humiliation. The reaction wasn't introspective. It never is when control is threatened. Instead of asking why the gift was returned, the focus turned to how dare it be returned. Respect was demanded where trust had long been absent. Loyalty was expected where care had been inconsistent. The familiar language surfaced again, sharpened and defensive, framing rejection as abuse and boundaries as betrayal. It was easier to feel wronged than to feel responsible. Inside that house, the narrative reportedly solidified quickly. The problem wasn't absence. The problem wasn't favoritism. The problem wasn't years of conditional affection. The problem, they told themselves, was influence. Someone else must have done this. Someone else must have planted the idea. Because the alternative, that a child had assessed the situation clearly and opted out, was too devastating to accept. That's the paradox of control. It convinces you that everyone else is incapable of independent thought while you desperately try to control the story. Therapy language became a shield. Buzzwords replaced accountability. Parental alienation, disrespect, ingratitude, terms that sound professional but function as absolution. If the child is manipulated, then the parent doesn't have to change. But beneath the rhetoric was something far more raw, rage mixed with panic. Not the grief of a father missing his daughter, but the fury of someone who had lost authority. The kind of anger that fixates on cost, on wasted effort, on postage fees and return labels. The kind that proves the point of the rejection without realizing it. The note echoed louder with every complaint. Love can't be bought. Each mention of money only underlined how deeply true those words were. Meanwhile, miles away, life continued without disruption. That's the part that stings the most for people who rely on chaos. The absence of fallout. No dramatic confrontations. No frantic apologies. No scrambling to fix what was broken. Just calm. Just routine. Just a